The Battle of the Palace of Justice and the persecution of an innocent man by narco-terrorism. On November 6, 1985, a day when the Constitutional Court of the Supreme Court of Justice would rule in favor of the extradition law in Colombia, the terrorist group M-19, founded by former FARC members with financing from the Extraditables, an alliance between the Medellin cartel and the Cali cartel, forces its way into the Palace of Justice in Colombia, shooting and murdering people and taking civilians hostage. In particular, the magistrates of the high courts of the judiciary. The objective? Prevent the ruling in favor of the extradition law. M-19 intended to carry out a sensationalistic act called the People's Justice. It would be carried out against judges and members of the executive branch. Their mission? Burn all court records against drug traffickers linked to potential extraditions and achieve a public relations triumph in the media, equivalent to, but on a larger scale than, that obtained in the occupation of the Embassy of the Dominican Republic years before, 1980, where, after negotiations, the terrorists were welcomed into Cuba like heroes in exchange for millions of dollars and freeing those taken hostage. The President of the Republic does not submit to the pressure of the terrorists, and he issues orders as Commander-in-Chief to the armed forces to assure respect for the Constitution and the rule of law. The Colombian Army, assisted by the National Police, carries out an operation with the aim of rescuing the largest number of hostages who were in the hands of the narco-terrorist group M-19 and defeating the perpetrators of such a terrible, brutal act. As commander of a tactical unit, the Cavalry School, Colonel Alfonso Plazas Vega receives the explicit order to advance the main force entering the Plaza of Justice with tanks. The colonel himself and his troops enter and break the resistance of the narco-terrorist group. Colonel Alfonso Plazas Vega was the first tactical unit commander to enter the Palace of Justice. Nevertheless, he was not the commander of the operation or the only official with command responsibilities within it. As commander of a tactical unit, Colonel Alfonso Plazas Vega took part performing strictly combat functions and never had competence or authority over the handling of those rescued. Once rescued, the hostages were removed from the combat zone in the Palace of Justice, and they became the responsibility of the state intelligence agencies, including military intelligence, the National Police, and the Administrative Security Department, DAS, Departamento Administrativo de Seguridad. That was as far as the operational responsibility of Plazas Vegas went. After 2 days of intense crossfire between the troops and the kidnappers, the Colombian Army is able to rescue over 260 people, including 40 magistrates who were being held captive by the terrorist group. Tragically and mercilessly, the narco-terrorist group M-19 manages to murder some of their hostages, including civilian administrative staff and also judges who could not be rescued by the troops. The narco-terrorists set fire to the huge National Judicial Archive of the court, where all the case files for the extraditables were held, producing a fire in which the flames took over the building, creating a tragedy of indescribable proportions. At the end of the tragic Holocaust and the devastating outcome of the events, and with over 100 people murdered, a huge controversy ensues, along with questioning about what could have happened to 11 people whose bodies never reached their family members. Since then, these people are considered by the media and claimed as the disappeared of the Palace of Justice. These people were workers in the cafeteria. Humble, innocent, hard-working people who had nothing to do with the cases against the mafia or with the narco-terrorism conflict in Colombia. In 1986, the Supreme Court of Justice created the Special Investigation Tribunal to perform an exhaustive investigation into what happened at the Palace of Justice. This tribunal was made up of 2 principal magistrates, Carlos Upegui Zapata and Jaime Serrano Rueda, with 10 special judges and over 30 auxiliary judges. The tribunal was comprised of colleagues of the murdered judges. This investigative judicial team was extremely concerned to find those responsible for the calamity. The tribunal finds that the Colombian Army acted under the mandate of the Constitution and in defense of the rule of law. The tribunal declares the narco-terrorist group M-19 guilty of the tragedy. The participation of Colonel Luis Alfonso Plazas Vega was investigated exhaustively, and the tribunal determined that the colonel completely fulfilled his responsibilities in the operation, and that his actions were all in the line of combat and in abidance with the law. With relation to the presumed disappeared in the Palace of Justice, the Special Investigative Tribunal concluded. Clause 17 of the report of the Tribunal to the Supreme Court of Justice stated, "There is sufficient evidence that the disappeared from the cafeteria were taken by their captors, M-19, to the 4th floor where they died." Lifeless bodies were found on the 4th floor of the Palace of Justice, to which a number of hostages were taken and where they were murdered by M-19. Among these bodies is a group of charred bodies that could not be identified. These lifeless bodies were murdered by M-19 on the 4th floor. By their number, the unidentified bodies coincide with the number of bodies that never reached their families, and must be them. The judiciary should insist on performing DNA tests on the unidentified bodies. This procedure could clarify many questions on what happened, and perhaps end the doubts on this case. The unidentified bodies were taken to common graves by legal medicine. For some strange reason, DNA tests have never been performed on these bodies. The Colombian justice system should establish with precision and overwhelming evidence whether what happened was a murder of people by M-19, whose burned bodies were never properly examined, or whether what happened was genocide. This mystery has not been clarified with decisive evidence. As soon as this mystery is cleared up, the Colombian state should look for the true intellectual authors and those who carried it out, and apply the full weight of the law. It is not fair that the families of the victims be used to divert the investigations, for that will only contribute to leaving in impunity those truly to blame for the human drama to which they have been subjected. The manipulation of some victims is aimed at condemning an innocent man who fulfilled his constitutional duty in critical moments that threatened the rule of law in Colombia, and who did irreparable damage to the drug trafficking structures in Colombia. On May 16, 1992, after 7 years of investigations, a judge finally finds the members of M-19 guilty and orders that they be imprisoned and punished. They were found guilty of the following aggravated crimes: murder, aggravated murder, kidnapping, terrorism, arson, sedition, rebellion, rioting, and document fraud. The remains of the 11 persons were never handed over to their relatives. The relatives of the presumed disappeared have rightly and legitimately sought the truth about what may have happened to their loved ones. In 1990, after a peace process, an amnesty is signed in which the M-19 group handed over their weapons in exchange for a pardon of their crimes against humanity and against political power. In 1990, Antonio Navarro Wolf, a member of the M-19 High Command, is appointed Minister of Health. The former M-19 terrorists gradually reached positions of power, giving shape to a political scene. By now, Antonio Navarro Wolf has been minister, senator, mayor, presidential candidate, and currently department governor. Gustavo Petro has a seat in the Senate of the Republic, but he was also a council member, consul, and now candidate for the presidency of Colombia. Vera Grave, one of the most outstanding M-19 guerrilla fighters, was a consul and is currently panelist in international forums. In January 1992, Plazas Vega requests retirement from the Colombian Army. For many people, Colonel Luis Alfonso Plazas Vega was an obstacle within the peace process with the terrorist group. As a civilian, 10 years went by in which Colonel Plazas Vega devoted himself to academic life, university chair, and work as a security consultant. In 2002, Dr. Álvaro Uribe Vélez is elected President of the Republic of Colombia. President Uribe and his Minister of Justice, Fernando Londoño Hoyos, decide to appoint Colonel Luis Alfonso Plazas Vega as National Director of Drugs, DNE. This appointment reflects the upright stance shown by Colonel Luis Alfonso Plazas Vega in the battle against terrorism and drug traffic in Colombia. As head of the DNE, he is able to strike crushing blows against the financial structures of drug trafficking in Colombia. He became a crucial part of the team that drew up the drafts of Law 785 on handling confiscated property and Law 793 on seizure with intent to expropriate. He won cases of seizure and expropriation of property and assets of the mafia worth more than 2 billion pesos. These successful cases included those against the lawyers and families of the drug traffickers, Pablo Escobar Gaviria, Gilberto Rodriguez Orjuela, and Miguel Rodriguez Orjuela, Jairo Correa Alzate, Iván Urdinola Grajales, Leonidas Vargas, Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, Jairo Aparicio Lenis, El Negro Asprilla, Luis Hernando Gómez Bustamante, a.k.a. Rasguño, Luis Hernando Murcia, a.k.a. Martelo, Jesus Amado Sarria, and Elizabeth Montoya of Sarria, Wilmer Varela, Efraín Hernández, a.k.a. Don Efra, Diego León Montoya Henao, a.k.a. Don Diego, Elmer Pacho Herrera, the Mejio Munera brothers, the twins, and Victor Patiño Fomeque. The property and assets seized included hotels, ranches, vehicles, planes, boats, bank accounts, and over 300 functioning businesses. The fund handled by the National Drug Office, Frisco, went from handling 100 billion to 600 billion pesos. Colonel Luis Alfonso Plazas Vega resigns from his position on November 9, 2004, after a political debate promoted by a group of congressional representatives belonging to the party made up of former M19 members, now called Polo Democrático. It is important to mention that historically the influence of drug traffickers on sectors of the Colombian Congress is public knowledge. The colonel's resignation was intended to spare the national government from being undermined politically. Strangely, in 2005, and 20 years after the events already investigated, the Office of the Attorney General of the Republic of the Nation decides to open an investigation against Colonel Luis Alfonso Plazas Vega for those presumably disappeared from the Palace of Justice. Colonel Luis Alfonso Plazas Vega has been confined at a military unit for over 2 years now. He has been accused by the Office of the Attorney General of the Nation of the crimes of kidnapping and forced disappearance and called to trial. It should be noted that in law, these crimes are mutually exclusive. Nevertheless, absurdly and weirdly, for the first time in judicial history, the prosecution is making them coexist for the Plazas Vega case. Consequently, Colonel Plazas has been confined for over 2 years in a military unit. Thus far, Colonel Plazas Vega has been not found guilty. There is no proof or any evidence that Colonel Luis Alfonso Plazas Vega has committed the crimes of which he is accused. What is true is that Colonel Plazas Vega's health has been affected by the situation in which he finds himself, where his human rights have been flagrantly violated by the prosecutor who is handling the case. The case is plagued with irregularities and violations of the norms of the law. This case is retribution by narco-terrorism. Plain and simple. This case is not a judicial trial with guarantees for the accused. It is a case built up on false witnesses. The prosecutor, Ángela María Buitrago, should be investigated for violation of due process and breach of public duty. Among other crimes, this official has assembled the case by accepting as evidence false witnesses fabricated by the prosecutor's office itself, drawing on criminals with long sentences to whom they offer economic benefits and even their freedom for testifying against Colonel Luis Alfonso Plazas Vega. There are 2 false witnesses fabricated by the prosecutor, who are thus far the cornerstone of the court case, namely Edgar Villarreal Cuyo, whose real name is Edgar Villamizar, but who in his testimony appears identified as Edgar Villarreal. The identity card and the signature do not coincide with the name of the witness. They are those of Edgar Villamizar. Edgar Villarreal does not appear in the Army's files. Edgar Villarreal worked as an employee of the Office of the Attorney General and belonged to the Technical Investigation Corps, CTI, Cuerpo Técnico de Investigación, which in itself disqualifies him from being accepted in a case as a witness. because he is a subordinate employee of the accusing body, the Office of the Attorney General. Edgar Villamizar is a retired Army corporal who never belonged to the cavalry school, according to its files. On the day of the events, he belonged to an Army unit located in the municipality of Granada Meta, and therefore could not have participated in the Palace of Justice operation in Bogotá, Colombia. He has never appeared physically in the court sessions during the case. The supposed evidence is a written statement put forward in a judicial inspection illegally carried out at the cavalry school, because it was done without the presence of the lawyers or the accused, which violates Colombian procedural laws. The other case is that of Tirso Sáenz, who is also a retired Army corporal who does not appear in the files of that institution as a participant in the Palace of Justice operation. He is in a prison in Cumbita serving a sentence totaling over 102 years. His crimes include aggravated murder, conspiracy, falsifying documents, theft, and personal injuries. On the day of the events at the Palace of Justice, he was under arrest for theft, and consequently it was impossible for him to have been a witness. He admits in his testimony that he was offered economic and prison benefits, and even his freedom, for testifying against Colonel Luis Alfonso Plazas Vega. With regard to Colonel Luis Alfonso Plazas Vega, his spotless resume shows that he never belonged to military intelligence units. He always belonged to combat units and academic training units. One of his most delicate responsibilities was being in charge of security for His Holiness John Paul II during his visit to Bogotá, Colombia. The Vatican only allows untarnished men to carry out this responsibility after exhaustive human and professional profile studies. It should be kept in mind that Colonel Plazas Vega won cases of seizure with intention to appropriate against drug trafficking, confiscating property and assets of over 2 billion pesos in his administration as National Drug Director. Clearly, Colonel Plazas is the military and legal target of the narco-terrorism that has penetrated the judicial system. The recent decision to confine Colonel Luis Alfonso Plazas Vega in the Picota prison, even though he has not been found guilty, violates international humanitarian law. Colonel Plazas Vega has not been released from the hospital and nevertheless was taken to La Picota prison in a questionable operation, or rather, an illegal assault by the INPEC agents on a hospital. In it, the colonel and his wife were abused and beaten. Colonel Plazas Vega was illegally given an injection, and thus far neither the substance that it contained nor the consequences for his health are clear. It should be noted that INPEC is authorized to carry out operations only in prisons and not in hospitals. By law, INPEC does not have police functions. By transferring Colonel Luis Alfonso Plazas to a common prison, his right to life is very much placed in jeopardy, since the colonel is very much threatened by the drug cartels and by their allies, the terrorist groups. So that the country may know the truth of the judicial case of the Palace of Justice, it is extremely important that the media make a careful, painstaking technical investigation with serious content based on documentary evidence, apart from rumors and conjectures. An investigation based on actual facts within the process is the only way that public opinion will be really informed objectively and understand a historic court case as important as that of the events of the Palace of Justice. The recent decision to confine Colonel Luis Alfonso Plazas Vega in La Picota prison and the attack on the military hospital by members of INPEC constitutes an aggression against the armed forces of Colombia. The armed forces, and particularly the National Army, are institutions whose men have fought and suffered to seek a better life for Colombians. Now, Colombia must support its army more than ever. The dignity of its men must be respected. What happens with the case against retired Colonel Luis Alfonso Plazas Vega will dictate the direction and manner of functioning of the Colombian justice system towards hundreds of cases opened without proof and wrongful detentions against soldiers of Colombia. Behind the case against Colonel Luis Alfonso Plazas Vega What is really at stake is the support of the justice system for the armed forces, and therefore the security of the nation. There are more men who are going through similar situations. There will be more to come if no concrete actions are taken in the matter. Military battles are not the only ones that must be won. If the legal battle against the army is lost, the war against terrorism in Colombia will be lost. The nation will turn into an anarchic state at the service of the drug business. Members of the forces of order ought to be punished only in the face of overwhelming proof of violations of the law. The recent meeting of President Hugo Chávez Frías with the president of the Polo Democrático, former M19, blurs the background of the flagrant revenge present in the case of Colonel Luis Alfonso Plazas Vega.
La decisión que hay en este momento de parte de las fuerzas regulares, ¿cuál es? Mantener la democracia, maestro.